Welcome to the New Masculine Podcast. This is a place where masculine identifying people come together in community to disrupt outdated models of masculinity and together construct new models for our way forward as men. As a special note, while this conversation is between men, this podcast values all beings and seeks to create positive impacts for all. I'm your host, Travis Stock. I am a master life coach, an equus coach, which means I often partner with horses when supporting clients, and I'm a teacher. In my coaching work, I am passionate about the balance of masculine and feminine energies in each of us, regardless of gender. I seek to help others nurture a relationship with both types of energy, which often leads to a greater sense of wholeness. And yet what I found in my work with men is that many of us have been taught messages about what it means to be a man by first teaching us to avoid anything that is associated with the feminine. That avoidance leads to few experiences of intimacy, emotions outside of anger, vulnerability, or even a sense of belonging. Striving to comply with these models of masculinity has many of us feeling isolated, ashamed, unworthy, afraid, angry, and depressed. That's why I started this podcast, to bring men together who are ready for something new, something more whole. Today I'm chatting with a man whose expertise spans quite the gamut. Keith Edwards is an educator, leader, and scholar whose work focuses on authentic masculinity, sexual violence prevention, allyship and equity, learning beyond the classroom, and leadership and coaching. He's written a new book that we get to chat about today called Unmasking: Towards Authentic Masculinity. In the book, he shares the results of more than 15 years of research and illuminates 3 phases of men's identity development: masking, unmasking, and becoming, all in service of helping men develop their own authentic masculinity. In it, he also offers strategies we can all use to engage men in our lives with more empathy, reach them with compassion, effectively hold them accountable, and help them become the men they aspire to be. Something I really loved about the book is how Keith's own identity development as a man is incorporated into what he's offering. As I try to bring my full self to these conversations, I found it really helpful as a reader to know Keith, with all his expertise, is walking this path as well. On a personal level, Keith identifies as a father, as a husband, and as white. So let's welcome him, his own path as a man, and his expertise into the new masculine. Thanks for joining me, Keith.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm super excited about this conversation.
Me too. I appreciate you reaching out. I appreciate you writing this book. I think there's this real strong metaphor playing out in a lot of men's work conversations around masking and unmasking, and I haven't really. We've talked about the concepts of the things that we perform to be in this world, but we haven't really dove into this metaphor itself. So I'm really glad that we get to through your book today.
Yeah. Well, can we start there? Because I'd love to talk more about masking.
Please do.
So this emerged from the participants in my research who were college men, and I interviewed all of them 3 times about what it meant to be a man, how that changed over time, and what influenced that. And one of the things that emerged was this notion of masking, and we can come back to exactly what that is, but they talked about this mask as this, as you just said, as this performance, right? Like I'm putting on my mask of masculinity, and it's not really who I am. And there's a real me behind this, but I know what it looks like and what I need to put on. And then multiple masks at the intersections of racism and classism and sexual orientation and so many other things. And so this metaphor of masking emerged from the research. And then I learned about all the other connections to it, which I think about learning about Judith Butler, who's a gender scholar, talking about gender as performance. This is another way of talking about masking. Even before that, Irving Goffman, who was a sociologist in the 30s, talking about life as sort of what you do in front of the stage to the audience, and then the behind the stage, behind the scenes kind of thing, which is another way of talking about this. And then James Baldwin, in The Fire Next Time, has this wonderful quote, which I won't get exactly right, but we'll get close here, which is that love takes off the masks we fear we can not live without, and know we cannot live within. And so I love Baldwin talking about masks and love as the antidote, as love as the thing that frees us from this thing we feel we have to have, but know is not working for us. And I think that's just a beautiful way for us to begin here today.
It's beautiful. And I mean, there's so many different versions of it, even down to like the kind of pop culture references that are big right now. As a gay man,
Yeah.
RuPaul's Drag Race is a big thing that's going around. And RuPaul always says,
Right.
we're all born naked and the rest is drag. So it doesn't really,
Mhm.
everything's a performance beyond that. And so
Right.
whether you're performing in female aesthetic drag or if you're
Mhm.
performing as a man, like we're all sort of
Right.
performing what we think we need to be in some way. And
Yeah.
I love that sort of invitation that love is really the thing that will set us free from those things so that we can be really
Yeah.
in that authentic space.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, let's dive into your story. I want to hear
Okay.
some about your own masking and unmasking process
Uh-huh.
since
Yeah.
we all have one. So what are
Yeah.
the stories that come to mind when you think about growing up as a boy in our culture and growing up into manhood? What did you learn you needed to be?
Well, I'll go back to the research real briefly here, but one of the things I said is, how are you expected to be a man? And they would share all those things that we know about: be tough, don't cry, drink beer, drive trucks, eat meat, all of those things. And I would say, well, when did you learn this? And every participant said, I've always known this. Now, they didn't actually always know it
Mm.
because, as RuPaul says, you come into the world naked. You learn this stuff over time, right? And so, but their socialization about how they're supposed to be as men begins before their memories.
hmm
And there's research about how this happens in the first moments of being alive after birth, how we begin to be socialized into that. And so, where it begins is a really difficult question. Some of my earlier memories, um, one of them I shared in the book is I remember being in fourth grade. I grew up in rural Wisconsin. We were sledding the whole town, right? School was out, too much snow. We love it. So we were sledding, and this other boy who I kind of knew, but he was a fifth grader and I was a fourth grader. And I just thought fifth graders had the whole world figured out. And I remember this fifth grader who had everything figured out in my mind turned to me and said, as we were walking up the hill to take another run, he said, "What kind of music do you like?" And I just remember thinking, oh no, how do I not get this wrong? I think that's an interesting response. One is not what kind of music do I like? And it wasn't how do I get this right, but it was how do I not get this wrong? How do I not embarrass myself? How do I not mess this up? And at that time in my life, I didn't even have a cassette tape at that time. Music was what my parents listened to, which was mostly local public radio or classical music or my dad's oldies tapes that we would occasionally listen to in the car, or maybe Casey Kasem's top 40
Uh-huh.
on the way home. So I love that you laughed at that. So it's still a connection. Um, but I remember thinking, I don't know any music. I have to prove my manhood, which is interesting that a, 10-year-old boy would have to prove his manhood, not prove that he's a boy, but prove his manhood
It's
at 10
such a
years old as a boy.
confronting question, even for me today. I can still see where I want to represent myself through like either look cool or butch it up in terms of what music I
Right.
like, or like I can think back to lots of times as a kid, but I can still see where I would struggle in that question. Like the whole like my wires, internal wires would fry in that moment, going like, how do I present this
Yeah.
well enough rather than just answering authentically?
Yeah. Well, and that's exactly how I felt. The wires were like, geez, oh
hmm
no. And I had no idea what I was talking about. And I just said the most manly sounding band names that I had ever heard, which were Odyssey and Journey, which are
Okay.
probably not the most manly sounding bands, but the names to me sounded science fiction and warlike and I don't know what. And he just said, "Oh, okay." And I said, "What about you?" And he said, "Oh, Tears for Fears." And I was like, I did the assignment wrong." Um, and he just said it so nonchalantly and comfortably, again, proving to me that he had his whole life figured out, which obviously wasn't the case. But I think that's just it's such a silly little example, but the silliness and the minutia of it to me illustrates how pervasive our socialization has been and how pervasive the pressure is. Like if walking up the sliding hill and just a casual, what kind of music do you like, was such a pressure cooker. Imagine when I fell down and skinned my knee.
Mm.
Imagine when they called me names on the playground. Imagine when I got punched. Imagine when I wasn't very good at sports. Imagine when I was really good at school, and all the things that came with that, that then say you're not man enough
Mm.
for whatever reason. And even if they didn't say it or think it, I certainly was saying that. Oh, this is another reason why they're going to see you as not man enough. You're going to be found out. And I think then that results in this performance, this masking, this putting your man face on, as Chauncey, one of my participants, said it very um, explicitly. Putting my man face on means don't laugh, don't cry, don't have any emotions. And he put his man face on when he was 10 because his father was incarcerated and he became the man of the house.
Mm.
Nobody told him you're the man of the house. That was all self-imposed. And that just meant like until he was 10, he could laugh, he could cry, he could have all these boyhood emotions. And at 10, like, no, I'm the man of the house now. And then on, I was talking with him, he was 22, and a professor of his had passed away. And he described sitting in the back of the church, no one around, and he wants that cathartic release of crying, and he can't. So after 12 years of putting this mask on, he's lost some of what is his real face.
Mm.
And I think that's the cost. Well, that's not the cost. It's one of the costs of this constant masking as we start to lose sight of what is the performance and what is authentic. Am I this mask or am I not? And I think there's a way that we can do that with consciousness, where masking can be a tool for self-exploration. And there's a way we do it without consciousness, where it becomes a process of self-delusion.
Mm. Yeah, there's a quote in the book about there's a difference between putting the mask on and the mask wearing us kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
find that to be such an important differentiation because I don't think the goal is always to necessarily take away people's coping strategies or safety
Mhm.
strategies when they need them, but it
Right.
is when they become so ingrained into like so enmeshed in our own identity development that we can't really tell the difference between what is a
Right.
coping strategy we picked up in the world and what is authentically who we really are.
Yeah. Well, and I love authenticity, and it's not always appropriate. And I think this is one of the ways authenticity gets weaponized is I'm a
Uh-huh.
jerk. Well, no, I'm just being authentic. That's really
Uh-huh.
what I think. No,
Yeah.
you're being a jerk. Um, so if I'm in a job interview, I may be really upset about my divorce, but that's not the right time or place
Mm.
to talk about that. It might
Yeah.
be authentic, but it's not the right. So I might put on the mask and do that. If I can do that with awareness, it can be a skill. It can, oh, I was tempted to share about this. Maybe I need to process later. However, if I'm in a conversation with some of my closest friends and I'm avoiding talking about the difficulty of my divorce, well, then I should have consciousness about that. I am avoiding this thing. Ooh, why can't I talk about it here? What's holding me back? Is it competition? Is it a fear of vulnerability? Am I afraid I'm going to cry? And what does that mean? Why wouldn't I cry? It evokes all these questions where if we're just avoiding it without that awareness, some of that comes up.
Mm. Yeah, so you shared the story about you as a fourth grader and sort of a pivotal
Mhm.
learning moment. What other moments come to mind that you can think of that are your own recognition of choice points between putting the mask on or
Oh,
showing up?
I mean, so many. I think doing this research for the past 20 years has not freed me from masking, but it has
Mm.
made me more aware. I
Hmm.
think I probably notice 20 times a day the thoughts that flit through my mind, like, is this blue checkered shirt going to be right for a podcast called The New Masculine?
Hmm.
Is it too blue? Is it, like that's
Am
just
I performing
silliness.
gender roles? Am
Yep,
I not doing
absolutely.
enough?
Yeah. But do I want to break gender for this? I don't
Uh-huh.
know. Like that's just like a half a second conversation I had with myself this morning, or how I engage or how I frame things, even in my self-talk. Um, yeah, I think there's just so many things. And I think that awareness, that consciousness doesn't stop it, because I have unlearned a lot of those scripts. I have unlearned a lot of the socialization. I have a lot of unlearning to go, because as soon as you unlearn, you're still living in the world and being socialized,
Mm-hmm.
right? I still watch commercials. I still listen to things. I still have friends and social media. So I'm being, at the same time I'm being socialized, I'm also unlearning some of that socialization. And those are both ongoing processes. And so how am I navigating through that? Um, and there are some things that I know better, but I don't do better,
Mm.
right? I know that it is perfectly fine in my relationship to cry, and I would not be met by my partner with derision or judgment. I'd be met with openness and affirmation and appreciation. And I still don't want to cry in front of my partner
Mm.
because I'm worried that I will lose my manhood with her, which is not based in anything rational or any evidence or any knowledge of her or me or our relationship. But that's something that's deeply ingrained. So I
Mm.
know that crying is healthy. I know that it would be welcomed. I know that it would be affirmed, and I still don't want to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that notion of um, we're constantly learning, wrestling with the unlearning, and then where do I know better, but I don't always do better. Like, I know this isn't a great example, but I keep using it. Or I know I should listen better, but I keep jumping to solving people's problems,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, yeah, everything from what we wear to how we show up to how we present ourselves to the examples we share. I mean, how many of us think of ourselves as honest people and then notice, like, kind of lied about that story for no reason?
Uh-huh.
What am I doing? And I think just the noticing, this gets to another whole aspect of the book, this process of becoming, where noticing where we're out of integrity
Mm.
is not a failure, but an opportunity to learn. Ooh, I'm out of integrity. I just lied as I told that story. Interesting. Well, maybe I want to do better. Or what caused that? I was afraid Travis might think this, and blah 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 blah. But how does our noticing of that dissonance, where we're out of alignment, become a tool for our growth and greater alignment?
And that's such an important skill that I think many of us men have to develop, that being able to notice and to get curious internally about what's going on for us rather than to just go into the habit and let it take over. And then some men might go, oh, I wish I wouldn't have like yelled at my kids again, or I wish I wouldn't,
Right.
and they feel shame about it, but there's not the introspective work to unpack what is really going on. And because we're not really taught to
Yeah.
do that work as boys growing up into manhood, we're sort of taught to just bulldoze through our emotions and just
Right.
be effective and be impactful and to win and to not really
Yeah.
spend time reflecting inwardly. That theme of that you were sharing about being challenged by crying, even though your partner would welcome it. It's like it seems like it's a theme that for a lot of men, but it seems like it's been a theme for you. There's a story in the book of a friend who suddenly died when you were younger,
Mhm.
and the desire to cry and the
Mhm.
way that your grief manifested more like frustration or anger rather than tears. Can you share a little bit about where that
Yeah.
took
What
you?
you can't see is Travis smiling about this embarrassing story he's evoking from me. Well,
Oh, it's my
and
empathetic smile. My
yeah,
apologies.
no, no. I think it's really useful because I tell that story in the very beginning of the book, following up on the story I began with Chauncey, which I just shared with you. And Chauncey saying, I was at this funeral and I wanted to cry and I couldn't. And really saying it's been from wearing this mask for so long. And then I was probably, I don't know, 32 years old, something like that. And we were having a massive holiday cocktail party at our house, 50 people, mayhem, total chaos, people from different aspects of our life, super fun, ton of work. Um, and one of my good friends one of my really good friends during college and someone who I had been close to since, um, she and another friend were coming over, so excited to see them, and other people are sort of arriving. And I get a call from the friend that says, we went to her apartment to pick her up. She didn't answer. I have a key. I keyed in and I found her body in bed and she's dead. And she was 30 at the time.
Mm.
Completely unexpected, out of nowhere. And here I am finding out this young, close friend is now dead, and there's 25 people in my house, and more people showing up like every 3 minutes. And half of them know her, and half don't. And I have to make this announcement that this person that some of them have been super more close to than anyone else in their life is now dead, and some of them don't know. And it was so sobbing and awkward, and people being like, I'm just gonna leave. I don't even know who this person is. I'm so sorry, but we're just gonna go. And and then every person who showed up, I had to like go meet them outside and be like, hey, just so you know, Jenny died, and you're walking into, it's not a party.
Mm.
And I had to do that like dozens of times. And that was just an awful experience. And then the next night I was with another one of my super close friends who was also super close with her, and we were just, alcohol was involved. We were super frustrated, and he saw things one way and I thought that was just ridiculous and blah blah blah. And we ended up getting in this heated argument, and I sort of got up to like storm out and leave in a hurry, and I slipped and fell, and I hit my wrist on the ground, and I just went home. And so then the next day, here I am at the clinic getting my wrist checked out because it really hurts. And we're texting, he and I are texting back and forth and like, so sorry, and blah, 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 kind of repairing over text message, which is one of my favorite ways to resolve conflict. We're pairing over text message, and we sort of both acknowledged like, I think you're dealing with this, and I'm dealing this with in very different ways. And both of them are okay,
Mm.
but they're really different. And we acknowledged, and both of us have been socialized to just not deal with this at all.
Mm.
And I think for a lot of people, and I think especially for men, anger is often what shows up when there are other emotions going on. I'm hurt, but I can't share my hurt. It's too vulnerable, so I'll show up as anger. It feels unfair. I feel diminished. I feel vulnerable. I feel whatever. I can't show that, so I'll be pissed. And that's an okay thing for men to express and to communicate. And I think, there's just a lot of socialization and unpacking. And then we went to her the next night. We went to her funeral, which was just terrible, and none of us spoke. And it was awful experience. And through that whole period, I never cried.
Mm.
I was devastated, and I never cried. I remember walking around me like, how does the world go on? How do people keep going to work? Jenny's dead. But I never cried.
That weird isolating part of grief where
Yeah.
the rest of the world can, they might be there, be able to be present for a moment of it, but they
Yeah.
can't hold it the same way the rest of
Yeah.
the you were in that moment. And thank you for being willing to share it in the book, but also here. I
Yeah.
think that's what I really appreciated about you incorporating your own story into the book, is I get to see myself and my own stumbling places, or my own
Yeah.
places where I misstep, or take my anger out on somebody that doesn't deserve it, or grieve in a kind of a wonky way. Like,
Yeah.
it gives me permission as a man to not be perfect, and um to learn from those moments, to
Right.
recognize that we're all on this journey together, and that sometimes it does get the best of us. And so I just appreciate you being willing to share that. And I also love the way that you and your friend came to resolution, which is to just see each other's versions as valid.
Mhm.
That I think that's such a lost art form right now. It's like we just expect agreement, or it's either agreement or conflict. And
Yeah.
it's like ability to be in the space where we have two different processes, and two truths can
Yeah.
be true at the same time, and that's okay. And it's not always clean and tidy, but it is sort of
Mhm.
this lost art that we have in our culture right now around being able to just see each other even if we don't see it the same way.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think we've lost the ability to navigate complexity. I mean,
Mm,
one of the ways to think about it is I've organized my work around keeping the complex uncomplicated.
mm,
And I think that's so important because we either want to get rid of complexity and make it simple, or we just want to have it be messy. And like you, I see all around either or, with us or against us, for or against,
hmm
and the most outrageous positions. And I think a lot of this is because of social media, where, I mean, the most outrageous position about whether Usher was good performer or not at the Super Bowl will be amplified.
Oh yeah.
The hated it will be liked and reshared by people who agree or and disagree. And the he was the greatest ever will also be amplified. And the people who are like, I thought it was fine, but I kind of thought this was a miss. Nobody cares.
hmm
And so then what happens is our ecosystem, we are confronted with the most polarizing perspectives on Usher's halftime. And then now extend that to politics, extend that to Gaza, Palestine,
mm,
extend that to Russia and Ukraine, extend that to poverty and hunger in our schools, extend that to trans people's rights to exist. And we don't get a lot of opportunity to think through that. Or, as you were pointing to, um, recognize that there are multiple truths.
mm,
Like, we're recording this on a Zoom call, we can see each other, but we are actually seeing different versions.
hmm
I'm seeing a mirror of me, and you're seeing an unmirrored version of me. So we're not even looking at the same version of me.
hmm
And I'm not, and right, and it's the same way. Now, both of our versions are true, but they're not the same.
hmm
And so, how do we recognize multiple truths can be there? Things can be both and. I like nuance, which is in between the binary option. I also like paradox, which is it's both of the things at the same time. A coin is both a heads and a tail,
hmm
right? It's not either or, it's both at the same time.
I think one of the often places where often conversations currently that we see that playing out is the concept of privilege.
Mm-hmm.
That privilege is often like if
Mm-hmm.
you assume that a white man has privilege, then it all like for many people that discounts the challenges that that person has experienced.
Mm-hmm.
And it can both be true that someone walks through this world with some level of privilege and also feels
Yep.
marginalized. My identity as a gay man feels that way. It's like I'm a tall white man with a lot of privilege, and yet I have this
Yep.
marginalized part of myself that I walk through the world carrying with me all the time and wondering about my own safety and my own
Yep.
rights and so being able to do the nuance work of being able to see that there can be two truths at once and that we can really reflect on that without it being so
Yeah.
explosive.
Can I say more about that?
Yeah,
Because
please.
I love this. I find it very useful to reframe I am privileged or I am oppressed to I experience privilege or I experience oppression. And I experience a lot of privilege, but it's not about me. It's not about who I am. It's not about my essence. It's not even about my white skin or my male sex characteristics. It is about how the world is organized
Mm,
around those things that I experience privilege pretty consistently and pretty constantly. But I think it's a really different thing to say I experience privilege or I experience racism or experience homophobia than I am oppressed,
mm,
right? It robs us of our agency and puts the problem in me, right? Or the advantage in me when it's really the way the world is organized. And I think we can experience both. So I had this experience where I was leading a workshop in the COVID times virtually around aspiring allies around anti-racism following the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, the city where I live. And I was leading this workshop and I was talking about this notion of privilege. And this 65-year-old white guy from rural Minnesota was like not having it. He emailed me afterwards and he said, how dare you call me privileged? I grew up poor with an abusive alcoholic father. I am not privileged. And I think when we say we are privileged or we're not, it's another either or.
Uh-huh.
You are or you're not. And I was thankful this was over email because I could think about it. And I responded and I said, thank you for sharing your story of poverty and classism, of addiction and alcoholism, and abuse and trauma. And I'm sorry that you experienced that. And I'm sure it was very difficult. And you can also experience privilege based on gender and based on race. I wonder what it might have been like in the town you grew up in to be poor with an abusive alcoholic father if you had been a Black girl. And he responded and said, thank you. I got it.
Mm.
And that was it. And at our next workshop session, he sort of talked about this both and. Like, I guess I do experience some real challenges and real hardship. And I see that it would have been a lot harder
Mm-hmm.
if I hadn't had these advantages. Because where he grew up at that time, he would have been the only Black girl. And what would have been like to seek help for that, and what would have been the consequences, and all of these things. And so the both and, as you're pointing to, of privilege, how do we recognize that? And oppression, because I think there's a lot of people who just walk around feeling like I'm oppressed. And where we experience oppression, where the world doesn't work for us, we really have to pay attention to it to survive and navigate that. So that makes sense. And then we tend to ignore the ways that the world does work with us. I was just on a run a couple of days ago, and I was out for the run, and I was like, I think I'm getting in good shape because this is I feel pretty good. Like, this is pretty effortless. And I was like, I think my time's gonna be good. Like, wow, I guess I've been really good. And then I turned around and the wind was in my face, and I was like, oh crap. I just had the wind at my back. And
Uh-huh.
when you have the wind at your back, you don't know it. But when I turned around and the way the world works wasn't working for me, boy, I knew it. And so I think that's a great metaphor
It's
for
such a great
systems
metaphor.
instruction and privilege.
That's such a great metaphor. And it doesn't imply that you are good or bad for feeling the ease that you were
Right.
feeling in that moment. It doesn't
Right.
inherently put shame or it's your fault or any of that kind of
Mm-hmm.
stuff. It's
Mm-hmm.
like just a realization of the direction of the wind.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so great.
Well,
Well,
once I turned around, I realized it.
well, I think that nicely leads us into conversations about your book because
Yeah.
the thing is that so many of the conversations in our current world around what's not working in masculinity and
Mm-hmm.
using the language of toxic masculinity, it's not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily something I talk about on this podcast, but it is sort of like the cultural conversation. So really reflecting on the power and privilege that men do have. And yet, what the theme of underneath this book is when you actually talk to men, many men are suffering. Many men are
Mm-hmm.
struggling underneath a mask and not feeling seen or witnessed or empathized with. And so
Yeah.
as we're talking about it, it's like it leads us nicely into it where we can have a conversation about maleness and
Mm-hmm.
masculinity and the impacts of that, but then also really connect to men and their experiences
Yeah.
of suffering, of trauma, of hurt. And so let's talk a little bit more
Yeah.
about unmasking.
Well, I think that in the conversations around men, oftentimes we don't have it. And in the places where we do have it, it tends to be this binary that you were pointing to. It tends to be a binary of criticality of men. Men are abusive, sexual violence perpetrated by men, men have power, they make more money, it's unfair, they have all these things, all true. Or there's a story of sympathy. Men are really struggling, boys are really having a hard time, despite men are attending college at lower rates, men have these mental health issues, men are dying younger. And as long as you only want to pay attention to the harm men are causing, or only want to pay attention to the way that men are harmed, you're not really going to understand the full picture.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so if we recognize that all of that is true, that men get paid more, that science has been done by us and on us, and we still die younger, that doesn't make sense. Right. Um, and so when we can really recognize gun violence overwhelmingly perpetrated by men, most of it by white men, sexual violence overwhelmingly perpetrated by men, some mental health issues more experienced by men, less likely to seek help. It's a complex story. And then you see the roots of that are really in patriarchy and how we're socialized to be as men. It's what leads to oppression of women. It's what leads to the yearn to eliminate trans people from existence. And it is what is confining men. And when we recognize that it's not a zero-sum game, that it is we're all in this together. And if we could figure out the roots of patriarchy and gender norms, it would free men. We would lead more fulfilled lives. It would remove systems of oppression that women and trans folks experience. This would be better for all of us. Now it becomes a group project that we all want to be in on. And so I think that both, and in my book, I talk about it as men are hurting. How did you hear that? Did you hear men are hurting others? Because that's true. Or did you hear that men are being hurt and are in a state of hurting? And both of those are true. So that men are hurting, but I think most people hear that one way or the other and not in both ways. So they're both and the roots of that are in patriarchy and gender norms, or what some people call toxic masculinity. I think the pushback I often hear is that it's not that men are toxic, and people who really talk about toxic masculinity, none of them think men are toxic. They think these external expectations of men are toxic, and they are to all of us, right? They're the things that teaches a boy he's the man of the house at 10 years old, and he can no longer laugh and cry and have emotions. It's what keeps a 32-year-old man who lost one of the closest people in his life from being able to cry. It's what keeps a man whose partner would welcome his exploration of emotions from hiding his crying at TVs and movies. These things are toxic. It leads to lower college attendance, mental health, death and dying, violence, all of these things. And that toxic is sort of the traditional expectations. And then there are many people who you're talking to who are talking about a healthier masculinity. And I love this concept and idea. It's about centering masculinity, not around drinking beer and driving trucks and eating meat and not crying and being tough, but around respect, being honest, being there for others, more positive things. And I love that. And I think there's a place for that in our cultural conversations. But for me, I also want to trouble that, because a healthy masculinity is a better mask, but it's still a mask. It's still an externally imposed thing that I'm trying to put on. For me, I'm not trying to find a better mask. I'm trying to break free from masks. And I would call that authentic masculinity. I think another worry that I have about healthy masculinity is who gets to define that. And I worry about men with positionality and power defining what healthy masculinity should be for urban boys or gay college men or rural men in Alabama. Who gets to decide what healthy is and who gets to impose that?
It's such an important nuance that I gathered from the book that I really appreciate you talking about, and I want to continue hearing more about, because it's like in alignment with where I've been going and yet haven't been able to necessarily put words to it. The closest I've been able to say is that, because I have had sort of pushback from some of my guests sometimes, they're like, well, how do you define the new masculine? And I said,
right.
The thing for me is that I don't want to be the one telling men what they need to be. Like, that feels like a tool of the old masculine. That feels like an old version of like someone now deciding for other people what it should be. And so that I love this sort of framework of from toxic masculinity to healthy masculinity as a step, as an important step that has a valid point to it. And then there's another level of evolution, or sort of another developmental stage, which is to move into sort of self-identified authentic masculinity.
Right. And I think authentic masculinity, how I experience that challenge, and I'm not there, but I'm working on it. How I experience that is this shirt masculine enough? Is it too masculine? Is it not masculine enough for a new masculine podcast? Do you want to wear that shirt? Separate from what's Travis going to think or what's going to happen. I I want to be able to say when someone says, "What kind of music do you like?" I want to be able to share, "This is the song that brings me to tears every time." Without having to think, what are they going to think? And what should I say? What's masculine? Or what? Um, um, I want to be able to be in conversation with my daughter and be genuine about my feelings and model for her how she could be genuine with hers, right? Without the external shoulds. And, traditional masculinity is just one set of shoulds. There's also traditional femininity. There's also, gay masculinity is another should. Rural masculinity is another should. And each of these multiple ones are also plural because there's not one rural masculinity, right? Do rural in Alabama, do rural in Minnesota. It's going to be really different,
Yeah.
right? So all of these are plural. But what I'm trying to sort through is, what are there things about traditional masculinity that I resonate with? Yeah. One of the things that's about traditional toxic masculinity is that men should eat a lot of meat. I eat a lot of meat. I love it. I'm into it. I had wings last night. It's really resonates. And it says I should drink beer, and I don't. And I grew up in rural Wisconsin. I got a lot of messages that you should drink beer, and I don't. So how do I pick and choose what's genuine for me? And that's a really difficult thing, as when you've been socialized your whole life, it's hard to figure out what is really you separate
Mm-hmm.
from the socialization. Um, there's a great story from the book about a guy who I was explaining this concept of masks and, the secret and hiding behind and this performance. And he said, I love football. And I was like, cool story, bro. And he was like, no, I love football. It's like, okay. I played high school football. I love college football. I love pro football. I love fantasy football. I love football. And I was like, we got it. And he said, now I'm just wondering, do I really love football? Or have I just been taught my whole life that I'm supposed to love football? And I was like, yes, exactly. How do you know what is genuine and authentic to you versus what has just been so deeply socialized your whole life? Exactly. And then he said, well, if I don't know if I like football, how do I know if I like girls?
Whoa.
And so the question is, once football's up for grabs, everything is a toss up after that, right? And he was kind of kidding, but he was kind of not kidding.
Almost an
But
existential question.
so it evokes the separate from masculine gender norms or the family you grew up in or how you were taught to be or taught not to be by your friends and your environment and your culture and everything. Separate from all of that, who are you really? And you can't ever separate all of that because it's all in the mix. And so I think you've used this word journey a couple of times. I think that's a really useful thing. Not I find who am I to be a difficult question.
It's too stationary.
It's too stationary.
Uh-huh.
Exactly. Who are you becoming?
Mm.
Finds me, for me, it's my favorite question. Who are you becoming? Because it's not who are you? It's who are you on the cusp of? Who are you leaning into? Who are you trying to be? Who you're aspiring to be? Who you're changing to be? I find that to be a really interesting, active, non-stationary question. And then it also assumes not just who do I self-identify as, but are you doing that?
Mm.
Right. And this process of becoming, which is the process toward authentic masculinity, is kind of identity, the who am I and who do I aspire to be? And I think those are two separate questions. And integrity, or what am I doing? I am an honest person. That's an identity. And I have lied 2 times today already. Let's put those in conversation. And I would have thought that we would figure out who we are first. And once I figure out who I am, then I would spend my life trying to be that consistently. And the research really taught me it's not that clean. It is more like a infinity loop on its side, right? Where my identity is in conversation with my doing is in conversation with who am I. And I might say, well, I guess I'm not an honest person. Or I might say, I need to lie less. Or I'm not a very good listener. And you start to have that identity. And then people start to say, when I'm with you, I really feel seen and heard. And you go, well, I guess maybe I need to change that identity that I'm just not a very good listener, and maybe I'm becoming a better listener. And I think that process of who am I and who do I aspire to be in conversation with what am I doing, and where does that line up and where does that not line up in this constant conversation is the journey, allows us to be works in progress, never finished. I love the line of that I use of always striving, never arriving. And one of my mentors, who I mentioned in the book, Tracy Davis, is very accomplished, but his end of his bio says, and Tracy is wildly unfinished.
Hmm.
And it's not only acknowledgement that I'm still on the journey, that I too am a work in progress. It's that humility, but
Mm-hmm.
it is a delight of that progress, that journey. Like I can't wait to see what comes next and
Mm-hmm.
what I leave behind. And I love the when I hear wildly unfinished, I just see a campfire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as I'm listening to you, I'm sort of like putting my coaching hat on. And when I work with my coaching clients, two concepts we're often talking about are either someone's values or someone's actions. And it sounds a little
Yeah.
like that's what you're kind of implying, that sort of both our values and our actions inform who we are. And it's not
Mhm.
just, oh, it's not fully encapsulating the story of who you are to just talk about your values. It also
Right.
has to, we also have to talk about your actions, but it's also in the
Right.
reverse is true. It's not enough to just look at your actions. It's important to look at your values and
Yeah.
how they align with each other, how they sit nicely together, where they're
Yeah.
in conflict with each other, where they're in
Yeah.
opposition to each other. Like that, those are two really important aspects of how we learn to become.
Yeah. And as we started this conversation, when they're out of alignment, how do we stop seeing that as a miss or failure, but as an opportunity to notice and learn and explore? I mean, when I coach a client who's like, my values are completely aligned with my doing, I'm like, well, why are we
Yeah,
talking?
why are
This
you
is
here?
boring. If you can't find some place where your values or your identity and what you're going about doing are out of alignment, you're not paying attention, because that's the human experience. So yeah, and I think, and this is sort of the advanced part. And so for maybe your folks who are into coaching, there's the identity and integrity, the who am I and what am I doing in conversation. There's an effortful state of that, of like, who am I? Like, how did I grow up? What am I going who do I want to be? Like, there's a really like deep exploration version of that. And then the doing too, it's like, why do I do this? And why is this dissonance? And what is going on? And what, there's a real effortful. And I think after doing both of those in conversation for a time, there becomes this less effortful state of being where we're not finished, but it's less effort. It's just more like someone says, oh, I noticed this thing and that doesn't seem really like you. And you go, oh, I think you're right. And just the angst and the effort and the work. And I think that's for me, that's where authenticity really shows up, where people have sort of separated themselves from the external shoulds of gender and other things. They've handled that inner critic. They've done some healing from their childhood traumas and the patterns that serve them well that no longer serve them. And they can just be present. And when those things occasionally show up, they just go, oh, yeah, that's another thing I'm working on. And it's not so angsty and effortful. And I think that's where coaching hopes to take people, where they develop those kind of capacities to be more fully present in this moment, be more fully with themselves, be more fully with others. And they can do that praxis. Um, I imagine, watching people on YouTube swim It looks like they're barely working. And then I get
Uh-huh.
in the water. It's a lot of work.
Yeah.
I just imagine someday maybe I can get to that effortless. It's not effortless, but less effortful state of being.
Mm. Yeah. You so nicely have been talking about sort of the lessons within the book and sort of the what comes from it sort of conceptually. And yet I'd love to hear two more things I'd like to pull you out on.
Yeah.
The framing of the book, like how does it, what's the like structure of the book so that when people are buying this, they know like, oh, that's why he keeps bringing up a participant, or that's what
Mhm.
Chauncey is. Oh, that I got it. Okay. So like some of the structure of how the book is laid out to
Mhm.
get to all of these concepts and the lessons. And then if there's anything else you want to share about the book that you think is important for
Yeah.
potential readers to know.
Yeah. So the book is really based on a 15-year research project, and I think that's the most boring sentence in the whole book. Um, 10 men that I have interviewed as college men in every 5 years since. And so we're almost to our 20-year follow-up. And so we've been having these ongoing conversations. And then my own stories, which you've done a wonderful job of evoking.
Mm.
And so the book is organized around this process of masking what traditional masculinity, these external expectations are, how they show up, how we put them on, and the consequences, and how we can sometimes break free. So that's sort of one part. And then the second part is this becoming, which we were just talking about, this identity and integrity. And I sort of explore that process and then tools for exploring our identity and self-awareness. And then another chapter around tools for exploring our self-management, our integrity, and doing that. That's sort of the second part. And then the third and final part is around creating change and how we can engage with men. And that one I wrote for therapists and coaches. I really wrote it for my daughter's kindergarten teacher because I imagine she doesn't know this, um, but I imagine she gets about 15 boys every year.
Mm.
And she loves them in her very own, very appropriate way. And I think she sees some of their socialization coming into kindergarten. And I think she sees it play out in kindergarten. And I think she wants to have an effect on it. I think she really wants to reach them. So, what might help her more effectively do this? And I hear this from a lot of therapists and social workers who are oftentimes women who are trained by women in cohorts of women who think, I understand power and privilege, and men have all this privilege and advantage. And now I have clients who are men and they're struggling, and I never saw this coming. How do I reach them? How do I help them? So to be helpful from a kindergarten teacher to a therapist and everything in between, parents. And then the final chapter is how do you and I, Travis, create social change? And what are strategies that help us do that so that fewer boys and men are socialized in the troubling ways that leads to all these consequences for all of us. So that's kind of the structure of the book and how I've laid it out. But it's based on research, but it's written not. If you want to be if you're a super nerd out there, there's 2 peer-reviewed articles that are out there that you can get into the methodology and intricacies of epistemology of grounded theory methodology. Happy to do that with you. This book was written for my daughter's kindergarten teacher to be helpful to her, even though she doesn't know.
I'm so glad you did that because even as a social myself as a social worker and as a coach, like as a man,
Yeah.
I often find it hard because I'm on my own journey as a man to unpack these
Mhm.
things. I'm on my own journey, and as a gay man, as a coach doing work with men on masculinity, there's all this like sort of internal work and confrontation of self and my own
Mhm.
what I learned growing up about my own manhood as a
Mhm.
gay man. And so there's all this internal work. And so to have somebody offering some insights about how we work with men, how we make an influence, how we show up with compassion and empathy, and how we help us all grow up, how we take this on
Yeah.
as like you said that earlier, like this, like it's this big group project we all get to work on. I love that
Yeah.
concept that this isn't
Yeah.
something about telling men they're bad and bringing shame into the equation. It's really about how do
Yeah.
we engage in this group project in a way
Yeah.
that's evolutionarily purposeful and
Right.
generative.
And fosters our collective liberation.
Mm.
I mean, I get a lot of freedom the more I unpack this.
Mm-hmm.
And I unlearn my own sexism. I'm a better parent to my daughters. I'm a better partner to my wife because the more of this I unlearn. And I understand systems and structures and institutions and can contribute to healthier dynamics at my kids' school and in my community and in the work that I do. And it is about all of us getting free. And I think when we understand that all of us getting free, it's not my freedom comes at your expense or your freedom comes at my expense, but we all get to collectively be free. I think particularly those of us who experience privilege, that shift to I experience privilege as a man or as a white person, and how are systems of patriarchy and racism also ruining my life? And when we pay attention to that, I call that enlightened self-interest. We become much more effective, consistent, and sustainable in speaking up and creating change for all of us.
Collective freedom. I'm so here for that.
Yes. Yeah, me too. Me too.
Well, is there anything else that you'd like to sort of leave men with as a last piece of advice, or any of the people that are listening? I do have a mixed audience. So if there's anything you'd like to leave people with, I'd love to hear one last little bit from you.
Well, I'll take you up on that opportunity to sort of think about two different options. So if you're listening to this, thinking about yourself and your journey as a man, here's what I'd offer. What's your masks? What are your masks? How and when do you wear them? How and when do you take them off? And how could you be more conscious about doing that? If you're listening to this, thinking about men in your life, whether you're not a man or you are a man, maybe think about your clients. If you're thinking about engaging men, how can you recognize their masks? And what would it take for you to engage with the man behind the mask, even though he may be really intent on only showing you the mask? What might that take with your social work client, or with your coach, or with your 5-year-old son, or your 21-year-old son? What would it take to engage with the man behind the mask, even if all he wants to share is the mask? And then if folks want to connect with me, it's super easy. My website is keithedwards.com. You can find the book there. My email is keith@keithedwards.com. And the best way to stay connected with me is on my website. There's a Sharing Fire newsletter. Every 2 weeks, I send out a newsletter. It's completely free. I just share things I'm thinking, which is usually my latest blog post. And then what I'm learning, my favorite delightful things, which the one that'll go out tomorrow is around self-righteousness and love as a verb. What I'm contributing, which would be being on podcasts like this, and then what I'm inspired by, which are delightful TV shows or music that is bringing me to tears or poetry that is inspiring me or other things like that. It's completely free. You get a nice free little gift, and it's just every 2 weeks you get a little something in your email inbox. That's a great way for us to connect.
Perfect. I will make sure that those are all in the show notes so people can easily find them. And thank you for those sort of suggestions right at the end. Those are some excellent questions you bring forward for men reflecting on their own self, or for people reflecting on men in their lives, whether you are a man, whether you're a coach, whether you're a woman, whether you're any person in this world who has a man in their life. That's a great question to ask about what would it take to relate to the man behind the mask, even if he's only willing to show you the mask. It's beautiful. Yeah. Excellent question. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful to talk to you. I'm so grateful that we got to talk about your own journey, but also your book, Unmasking Towards Authentic Masculinity. And if people want to get in contact with me, you can go to my website at travisstock.com. You can also follow me on Instagram at Traver03. That's where a lot of the ongoing conversations of the podcast are going on. So if you're interested and want to talk about what came up for you in this conversation, please find me there. And I'm also on Patreon. If you want to be a supporter of the podcast and the mission, please go to patreon.com/thenewmasculine. Thanks again for joining me, Keith. And until our next episode.